Hi, this is Module 3, Lesson 5. We're going to start today with S.18, and I recognize that there are some students who have already gone through this page, so I just ask that you bear with us as we move through it so that you can hear it once again and make sure it's nice and clear. So example 1 talks about the opposite of a number. And the question is, what is the opposite of 8? And how can we illustrate this number on a number line? So it starts off with what number is 8 units to the right of 0? So we make this bigger. We can see, based on our number line here, that to the right of 0, 8 units would be marked right here. And so the number that is 8 units to the right of 0 is positive 8. B says, how can you illustrate locating the opposite of 8 on this number line? Well, we know that the opposite of 8 would be going back to 0, or resetting, as has been said by some other students, back to 0, and then starting and going 8 units to the left of 0. And that will put us here on negative 8. And so the opposite of positive 8 is, as you all know, negative 8. Use the same process to locate the opposite of negative 8. What is the opposite of negative 8? Again, now the opposite of negative 8 brings us back to 0 and then back to the positive 8, which is where we started originally. And so the opposite of negative 8 is positive 8 again. So the opposite of a number is, as we've discussed in the past, the original number. That we started off with. So the way that this is best illustrated is using the chart we have here. So I've gone ahead and taken the liberty of writing down some names and a card that they may have chosen. If we were in school, we may have been able to use cards and work in groups, but chances are we would have just done something like this anyway. Okay, so the first one says Jackson has card number is A. And the first thing we need to write is the opposite of card A. And the way I want to show you this right now is the way that we write this. So we write it using a negative sign, and we say the opposite of positive 4. And so we all know that the opposite of positive 4 is negative 4. But when we say the opposite of the opposite, we're saying the opposite of 4. And that will equal positive 4. We can also read it as the opposite of negative 4, and that equals positive 4. So the opposite of an opposite is the same number. Okay, the next one would be the opposite of 150, and we'll write that inside the parentheses. And that, as we all know, is negative 150. So now what we end up writing here is the opposite of this negative 150, which we know to be, again, the positive 150. This is where it gets wonky when we start talking about negative. So if we say the opposite of, and we put the original number inside the parentheses, negative 6, you know that the opposite of negative 6 is positive 6. And now if we say the opposite of negative 6, now that equals positive negative 6, which is the original negative 6, sorry. Okay? And this reads as the opposite of negative 6 is negative 6. So the next one is the opposite of negative 9 equals positive 9. And so now we read this one as the opposite of our negative 9, two parentheses, is negative 9. It was the original number. So here we're asked to write for number 1 write the opposite of negative 10 as an equation. So we're going to use some parentheses to help us write this. The best way to do it is to say the opposite of negative 10. Now we're going to close the parentheses behind negative 10, close the parentheses behind the opposite, and then close the parentheses behind the next opposite. So we had 3 parentheses that we used, 1, 2, 3. We're going to have to close 3 parentheses at the end, 1, 2, 3. That's what that means. And that will equal negative 10 because it becomes the same number. Okay, so in general, the opposite of a number line is, again, the original number. Now, providing a real-world example, I'm going to go ahead and provide one for you so we don't have to spend time thinking about that right now. So here's a real-world example that we can use that I think we all feel comfortable with. It's the opposite of 100 feet below sea level is 100 feet below sea level. So if you went up and then back down, you would end up still at 100 feet below sea level. Below that is the opposite of negative 100 is still negative 100. Okay, so let's move on to the next page. Now here's where you get to fill in an answer as well on that puzzle. So read each description carefully and write an equation that represents the description. So the opposite of negative 7 is, and so what you're going to write it, the way you're going to write it is the opposite of negative 7 equals the opposite of 25. So the opposite of 25 and then the opposite of 15. So the opposite of 15 equals, and the opposite of negative 36. So the opposite of negative 36. Okay, for the first one, the opposite of negative 7 is 7, positive 7. For B, the opposite of 25 is 25, positive 25. For C, the opposite of 15, positive 15, is negative 15. And for D, the opposite of negative 36 is positive 36. Okay, Jose graphed the opposite of 3 on the number line. First, he graphed point P on the number line 3 units to the right of 0. Next, he graphed the opposite of P on the number line 3 units to the left of 0 and labeled K. Finally, he graphed the opposite of K and labeled it Q. So, always you read it first and then you go back. The first question for A is the diagram correct? Explain if the diagram is not correct. Explain his error and correctly locate and label Q. So it looks like he labeled K and he graphed opposite of P, the opposite of P on the number line 3 units to the left of 0 and labeled it K. So first let's go to P, 3 units to the right. 1, 2, 3, this must be P. And then he did Q, 3 units to the left of 0. P, he labeled it Q. Finally, he graphed the opposite of K and labeled it Q. Okay, I just misread that whole thing again. First, he graphed the point P on the number line 3 units to the right of 0. We got that. Next, he graphed the opposite of P on the number line 3 units to the left of 0 and labeled it K. It should be the opposite. That would make it negative 3, and that's correct. Finally, he labeled the opposite of K. He graphed the opposite of K and labeled it Q. So let's do that right here. Because the opposite of K, negative 3, would be positive 3. So A says, is his diagram correct? explain, if the diagram is not correct, explain his error and correctly locate and label the point Q. Well, it looks like his diagram is correct because he labeled them exactly opposite each other, and they are the same number away from to the right or to the left of 0. So his diagram is correct. Write the relationship between the points P and K, K and Q, and P and Q. So for the relationship between P and K, what do we know about these two points, P and point K? They are opposites. And then, what about K and Q? They are all also opposites. What about P and Q? What do we know about them right now? They are the same. All right, let's move on down to number 3. For number 3, it's tricky, and we must read the directions carefully. Read each real-world description, and then write the integer that represents the opposite of the opposite. Show your work to support your answer. So A says a temperature rise of 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, rise means positive, so that's positive 15. And so if we were to write that out, we would say the opposite of positive 15 equals positive 15. Okay, so now you get to do a gain of 55 yards. How do you write that as the opposite of the opposite? A loss of 10 yards. The opposite of the opposite. A withdrawal of $2,000. The opposite of the opposite. Okay, the next part, the direction says, write the integer that represents the statement. So it's not opposite of opposites, we're just writing the integer. And then locate and label each point on the number line below. I will refrain from labeling the number line because I'm going to have you answer the question in Edpuzzle. So the opposite of a gain of positive 6. Kind of gave that one a little bit. B says the opposite of a deposit of $10. C says the opposite of 0. That's tricky. Let's see if you remember. D says the opposite of 4. And finally, the opposite of a loss of 5. And that concludes this lesson. We can, I'll show you how to put on the number line during class. But what I want you to do to go along with this lesson is IXL M.4. As always, it's the 6th grade. And you thought the other IXL was easy? This one you're going to breeze right through. The only thing is when you get to the 90s, you'll get the opposite of the opposite a little bit more. When you get up to I think the 85 and 90. So do your best. Try to get an 80 out of it. But if you can get higher, that's even better. And I will see you in class.